welcome to Network Conversations, brought to you by the National Network of Youth Ministries. In this episode, Wayne Morgan, National Ministries Coordinator for NNYM, centers our conversation around mentoring leaders. So let's join the conversation.
Yeah, so we're going to jump in with Wayne Morgan as our guest speaker. If you guys don't know Wayne, he is on staff with NNYM. He is I'm double checking on the title because I've always messed this one up, the National Ministries Director. For me, one of the things that I remember first learning or meeting Wayne, learning about him was it was the Download Youth Ministry or the youth specialties, or they'd have these little promo videos, and Wayne was always in the background somewhere just kind of hanging out with people, and I'd be like, who is this guy? He's always in the background of a picture or a video, and I don't know who he is. And then I got involved with NNYM and met Wayne, and to me that's part of who Wayne is. He's always around, he's always supporting, he's always listening and guiding, and it's not about him and his name. So that was what I love. In fact, when I asked him, like, how do I introduce you, because you're now kind of my friend and colleague kind of thing, that it feels weird, because I don't know, I'm just a tall, skinny white guy who loves Jesus. So yeah, that's Wayne. But he's been around, he's done a lot of rural ministry to urban ministry to parachurch ministry to church ministry. He's got a lot of experience in this and in mentoring. So Wayne, I'm going to let you kind of run with your thoughts on mentoring, and I'll pop in with some questions here and there.
Well, sounds good. Welcome, guys. I guess the reason I got this job for this conversation here today is I'm really good at finding people that are better at doing my job than I am. So I just give them the keys and let them run. And so it hasn't always worked out really well for me. There have been times when I'm like, ooh, we're going to have to do some special work after that. But for the most part, all of us work in an area where we utilize people, we have volunteers. So in the chat right now, what I'd like you to do too is what areas do you utilize volunteers, or maybe because of COVID or because you're growing in ministry, what areas would you like to utilize volunteers at a greater level? This month is National Volunteer Appreciation Month. So hopefully kind of blending the idea of volunteerism with mentoring leaders, because our volunteers are leaders. And so what areas do you currently utilize volunteers, or would you like to start utilizing volunteers? So go ahead and drop that in the chat right here. Because our hope is today that the space that we're talking about has transferable information across the board. So some of us are working directly with students, and so we need volunteers around our ministry. Some of us are thinking about on that networking level, where we're trying to have people grab a hold of leadership, start running with volunteers a little bit better, and run networks without us being there. And so as we think through mentoring leadership, I know that there are a lot of different ways of thinking about how do we mentor leaders. So one of the reasons that I care about this, and what Nick said is exactly what I want to do. I don't want to be the point person in every single place I'm at. See right here, about 2006, I was diagnosed with stage 4 or stage 3 high-risk testicular cancer. I was given a 40% chance to survival. And so in the space of 3 years, I went from thinking that I was Superman to realizing that I could have a relapse of some sort of illness and get taken out just like that. And so instead of creating a ministry around my personality, instead of making me do, like, I wanted to help other people, and I wanted to move the gospel forward, right? Like to empower people to lead. And so in that space, I started thinking about my leadership a little bit differently. I started thinking about, wow, what'll happen after I'm gone? Will things completely evaporate when I die, or will there be more capacity? Will people run in my space? And so I started thinking, man, how do we do this? And I remember going to a leadership conference and thinking about how we model our leadership like Jesus. And so I want to encourage you guys, as we think through this mentoring leadership space, I want to encourage you guys that there's an idea that you will not always be the leader where you are. Are in your leadership, are you building leaders actively? In National Network of Youth Ministries, we have a thing called +1 leadership. Do other people know what you do? Could they start to replicate it? How can they join you in that process? Or, some of us we protect our title. We're like, hey, don't touch this. This is really important for me. I don't want you to mess this up. So are we actively building leaders, or are we protecting our title? And for some of us, we would love to give away our responsibility, but when somebody volunteers for us, we're like, all right, here you go. Here's the credit card. Just go ahead and don't burn the place down. Like we have an enormous amount of weight that gets put on people when they do volunteer. And so have you ever thought about an onboarding process for leadership? Some of you have a mandated onboarding process due to the organization you work for, but have you ever thought about how you recruit people into partnering with you in leadership? And so I want to throw this out to you. This is I want you to think about onboarding leaders kind of like when you onboard onto a highway, right? First off, you need to ask. If you model your leadership after Jesus, then you have a ask. Like Jesus had people who followed him because he was cool, but he specifically took the time out and asked. Some of us have fallen into the idea that if we advertise, if we post stuff on social media, that'll draw people in. It never does. You probably are here today because you were asked at one point in time, you were suggested, but you didn't just probably, I'm going to guess, the majority of you weren't on here because you were scrolling through Eventbrite and you're like, hey, that's a good idea. Ask people, don't advertise. Then the next part, there you see there's like number 1 and number 2. There's a stop sign or a yield sign at the top of every on-ramp, even in Pennsylvania where your on-ramps are like 80 feet long, so like there's a yield sign there, and you're like, there has to be a spot where you go, hold up 1 second. Here is what you're applying for. In Pennsylvania, we have to have background checks if you work with people. I don't know what the state that you are working with has for applications, but some of us have organizational things that we need to accomplish in order to allow somebody to volunteer with us. And so there is a little bit of a pause on that on-ramp process. Have you ever thought about that before? Or do you just throw people into the mix? The next thing I want you to see on this thing is that there are 3 lanes here. And I think that's really important because when you think about leadership, when you think about helping out
before you jump to the next thing, I got a question for you off that.
Yeah, go for it.
So I was looking at some of the comments coming through of where people have volunteers. Doug Rank had a comment that really hit me of, man, what happens when you have that moment where you're bringing someone on, you've got the on-ramp going, things are going well, and they take a job somewhere else or they move to a different position? How do you balance that kind of on-ramp fatigue that might happen of, man, again, I poured in and they bailed on me?
Yeah, that's a great question. Probably because all of us are experiencing the volunteer fatigue right now with COVID. And that's probably going to be a great conversation for the small group. Appreciating your volunteers well is important. at this point in time because people are so exhausted. I think when you're in one of those places where you have a transient community, this is one of those things that you'll feel more than the people who are in a small town, you know. So somebody who lives in rural Iowa who rarely has job transitions or people moving in and out, it's a different feeling than somebody who's in a suburban area where they have military contracts or people are working for larger corporations. And so I know my friends in Virginia, like Northern Virginia, they deal with this all of the time. And so in those spaces, I think the volunteer fatigue, we've got to recognize that. And that's one of the reasons that I suggest having 3 levels of leadership in an organization, because if you have somebody that goes from on ramp to high level leadership and then they jet 2 months later, that really hurts the momentum of your organization versus slowly allowing people to have more responsibilities. So it probably is a good idea for all of us in that conversation about volunteers to have those questions about, hey, how long are you in this area for? And to frame their volunteer experience around that. If they're a high capacity person, but they can only be in the area for another 6 or 8 months, you might have them as a guest teacher once in a while, but probably not a small group leader in your organization. So, and understanding each other's their relational capacity versus their administrative capacity. There's so many different places that the next thing I wanted us to think about is we've got to listen to the people who are volunteering with us, to those leaders that we walk beside. If we're not asking the right questions, we could set ourselves up for some big failure if we're not trying to find out how this spot can serve you. Did that answer the question?
Yeah, no, I think for sure.
So one of the things that I've done it more with National Network of Youth Ministries than with in the past is I've started asking people, hey, what do you want to do? Trying to help people, because I know that our organization has certain goals, but I also recognize that Kevin has different dreams than Phil Ball, and that Nick has different dreams than Mark Shaner. And so as we start thinking about the people that are working with us, evangelicals do a great job at answering questions people don't necessarily have. And so what questions does your community have? What questions, what is your volunteer really there for? Are they there because they just like being around people, or are they there to reach students for the advancement of the gospel? Are they there for their own personal development? There's a lot of things that go into volunteering. So asking the right questions of volunteers, trying to figure out, hey, what do you need is really important. Are we asking good questions? Are we listening for are we listening for what they have to offer? And I think it's really important, coming out of COVID, obviously every single one of us, our communities have changed, radically changed, brand new things that are popping. And so if we're not listening, we're going to miss it. And so here's something else I wanted to throw up to you guys is this is I'll send it to you. This is a leadership diagram that is out of an Australian company, Gen Z research in 2017, when Gen Z conversation was just starting up. I found this, and I think it's absolutely phenomenal, just the differences between generations. And I want us to be aware that the Gen Z, the Gen Z generation that we're thinking about, well, in reality, they are probably seniors in high school or the youth pastors that just graduated that you're working with. That's Gen Z. And we're also talking about we have to be thinking about Generation Alpha, who is massively affected by COVID, but they haven't started spending enough of their parents' money to be focused on research yet. So, and you know that's how research that happens, right? They start spending their parents' money differently than the previous generation. And so, but what I think is really interesting for us when we're talking about mentoring leaders is the look of how leadership is different. When I was sick, I saw 3 years, a year and a half, 2 years of completely out of ministry. And then about a year and a half of going back into ministry, everything changed. Kids started having iPhones. It was 2006 to 2009. By the time I started back into ministry, people didn't have flip phones anymore. They had smartphones, and they were getting in all sorts of trouble. And I was like, wow, this is so different. Their leadership style is also different. Somebody who is a boomer wants somebody to direct them versus somebody who's a Gen Xer wants a coordinator. They want somebody that's going to be collaborative. Gen Y, my generation, I just want the leader to let me know what I can do and help me if I have some problems. Gen Z, they want to be empowered. They want to have the keys. They want to go. They want to run. And there's a collaborative feel of millennials to alpha. They all want to be part of the process. They all want to be in the space where they're thinking in collaboration, where they're walking hand in hand. And so the question for us as mentoring leaders is, are we waiting until it's too late to start mentoring those leaders? Or are we starting to recruit them earlier and earlier and earlier? I think that Jesus recruited some of the worst, lowest grade leaders to help out with leadership. They would fail every single one of our leadership measures, but the reality is he grabbed a hold of them, spoke life and spoke truth into them, walked beside them, and it's harder, it's messier. And as we become more and more post-Christian as a society, the high caliber kids are going to be, their priority is going to be sports or some of those other spaces. And so recruiting some students, we may have to lean into kids that don't think positively about themselves, that could never see what as a bigger, broader perspective. And so my last thought for us before we jump into the next phase is, I want us all to recognize that you are a spiritual leader within your community. You don't look at somebody else's, oh, it's only the lead pastors, it's only this. If you're here, you're watching this on YouTube, whatever, you have to recognize that you are spiritual leadership within your community. And so in that mutual mentorship, are you connecting with other leaders in your community? Or do you see other spiritual leaders as threats? Are you cheering other spiritual leaders on? Whether it's the person that you're really frustrated with within your own organization or other denominations, other churches that are out there. And then my other thought is, are we recruiting young leaders to follow Jesus, or are we just expecting them to show up and hear what we have to say? So in this whole process of leadership as mentoring leaders, for me, I was forced into this because I know I have an expiration date. Do you know you have an expiration date? And if you were forced to leave the space that you are right now, how well would what you're doing currently be carried on for the next 5 to 10 years? And so in that space is where I started thinking and dreaming about, all right, how do I work myself out of a job? And so I had somebody ask me, well, why would you go work with National Network of Youth Ministries? Why wouldn't you just start Wayne Morgan Ministries? And I was like, yeah, because when I die, Wayne Morgan Ministries is done. But National Network of Youth Ministries, I can help build a team that's going to be better than me, and I can empower them to do what God has called them to do, and I can help a team grow together to follow Jesus. So
Awesome. I think one of the things that kind of stands out to me in that conversation is just character. This idea of the leader's character is so important in this, and the heart behind why we're leading and how we lead. And that's kind of the launch pad, the starting point for our small group discussions as you guys drop into groups in just a second. I just dropped the questions for you to kind of have a guide. We're going to talk about the idea of how do you develop skills and recognize character in others to lead cooperatively? How do you give energy level leadership roles? Entry level. I can't read right now. What are on-ramps to leadership, and how do those look in your area, in your sphere? What does that look like? And if you don't have them, what would it look like to develop that? And, on the top of your head, is there an easy first step for that? But also moving into this idea of what do the next steps in developing a culture of cooperative leadership look like in your community? Take as much time in each one of those as you feel you need. Don't feel rushed to get to all of them. Let the conversation flow from what you think is where your group needs to discuss. So Phil's going to drop us into groups. Thank you, Wayne, for sharing that with us. I thought the Gen Z stats, that was awesome to see. So cool. Thank you, guys.
Feel free to pause the video here and think through these questions yourself or with the group that you're viewing this with. When you're ready, unpause to hear more of the conversation and the takeaways from the youth workers that joined us live.
Between Wayne and I, we will have a conversation of just, hey, what did you guys hear in your small groups? What was that one thing that you're like, hey, we got to share that in the large room?
I felt like what we were getting towards the end was huge. Ross and Jerry and Dottie was in my group, and then Kevin. But the idea of casting the vision big, because there is some pretty stiff requirements to be a volunteer in those organizations, and a lot of documents that have to be filled out. And so what I heard is making sure that the vision's loud and clear, so that you want to go through the steps. You want to go through the process. You want to be onboarded because you want to be about that vision.
Mm-hmm. So is there a difference between having, do people follow the vision or do they follow you?
Are you asking me or are you asking
I'm just asking, like, is there a difference between, when we're talking about mentoring leaders and stuff, is there a difference between recruiting somebody to follow the vision or follow you?
Are you asking me or are you asking
I'm just asking, like, is there a difference between, when we're talking about mentoring leaders and stuff, is there a difference between recruiting somebody to follow the vision or follow you?
I think it's both. They have to want to play on your team, but it's not just you. There's definitely a vision to reach students, reach kids. But if they don't want to play with you, I won't say for you, but play with you, it's just there's going to be rub. So you're the coach. They kind of got to play your system to some extent, I think.
I think in the beginning they follow you, and then over time they buy into that vision. But in the beginning, it's your relationship with them. Especially, you're recruiting, you want to build relationships with your people and not just, I think in the beginning it's they're following you, and then they buy into the vision over time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's interesting, Jeff, because I did hear somebody say that they got to buy into you before they buy into the vision. It's good.
I think there's also a balance there of a lot of us as leaders, we can like that. We can like them buying into us, and we will tend to delay that stage of transition because we like the attention. You got to be cognizant of.
So it just popped in my head. Jesus says, follow me. I will make you fishers of men.
Cool. Wayne, do you have anything that you would want to wrap this conversation up with, of how you kind of would frame it as a last thought from you?
I think for all of us, just like what was touched on, the relational side of recruiting, we just have to remember that it has to be an ask. There has to be relationship built between us and the people who we desire to walk beside. And I think now more than ever, like with the title of this conversation, mutual mentoring is one of those. Like, we've got to learn from older generations how it worked back then, but also we've got to listen to future generations and go, what do you need? And we as leaders have the best leaders will be able to tie all of that together for your community. So don't be sad if your leadership structure in your organization looks and works different from somebody else's, especially those of you who are part of bigger national organizations. I think COVID taught us one thing: every community is different. And every community needs something different. Good. So let's ask those great questions, and let's answer the questions that our community is looking for. And the gospel offers a lot of leeway and a lot of flexibility. So let's be asking questions. How can we as the church show Jesus to our community best? And if youth group starts looking different, or if your campus ministry starts looking different, because that's the question your community is asking, I think that's the best kind of leadership. So build a relationship, find out what the needs are, and in faith, step into those spaces and see what God does.
Wayne, thanks. I love the pictures. I love the on-ramp. I loved all that. I love the graph that you promised that you were going to send us. So we're going to hold you to it. Those are good.
I already sent it to Phil. Oh, I could actually drop that other Gen Z graph. I'll drop that in the chat right now.
Okay. Because that was good. I can see us using it. But we're going to get together in May 10th, if you want to put it on the calendar, and talk about collaboration. And we're trying to get Lucas Ramirez on. I shouldn't probably say that in case he can't, but he wrote the book with Mike DeVito. But we think he's got some things to say about how we can collaborate and work together.
Mm-hmm.
And since, Kevin, you're still with us and looking healthy there, why don't you wrap us up?
Will do. Yeah. Forgive me. I have the bucket with me just in case. My sons gave me some stomach flu. But I am glad to be here with you, and especially because we've got some neat stuff coming up as well. If you haven't heard our free refills, that's something amazing. We got a podcast. Nick sometimes is on there, and just the idea of how to fill your soul as a youth leader. That's what we've got that about. And then our next network leaders training. If you want to train other leaders to be networkers, lead networks, May 26th, that's happening. We'll have a follow-up email for you that'll have these kind of details in it. And with that, we will also be putting all the pieces together, so you've got that all with you. Let me go ahead and pray for you all right now, that you can continue to mentor leaders and be mentored by leaders. Thank you, Jesus, for these amazing people, for the amazing way that they choose to follow you, because you're making them fishers. And with that, God, help them to be able to on-ramp other leaders, to be able to be mentored, to mentor others, just to see how you're working. And in all this, we want to see every teenager come to know you, because we want heaven to be so populated that there's nobody that can be in hell anymore, because there's just not any space. All of them are hanging out with Jesus in heaven. So thanks. We'll catch you later. Amen. Bye.
Thanks for viewing this network conversation brought to you by the National Network of Youth Ministries. We hope it helps you to set the table for unity and further conversations with other youth leaders. Any shared links are in the comments section on NNYM's YouTube channel. And while you're there, feel free to like and subscribe. If you want to join our next conversation or training, you can find upcoming live events on our Eventbrite page. You can also connect to a local network leader at nnym.org. We're here because we are better together.